Hi, this video is going to be all about An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Amborse Bierce. This is a short story that has a ton of themes and it's actually really short, so it's like 9 pages or 10 pages. Depending on the format you're reading it on, it's really short. It's about a guy named Peyton Farquhar, who's a younger man. He's 35. I don't know, he's not old. Depending if you're a kid or not, he's really not that old. Youngish man. He sought glory in war and honor. He's trying, look, he's a Confederate, but he's not a soldier. It's very clear in the short story that he's a civilian. And there's a couple themes that I'm going to talk about. I have 10 main ones, right? I'll probably deviate a little bit, just my style. This video is going to be time-stamped, so if you want to skip around a little more, you're more than welcome to. The first theme that I think is really important and interesting as well is death. So this entire short story is essentially about a guy who is a farmer. And I'll get more into this, but essentially he's a guy that lives with his wife and his kids, and he's trying to do his part for his country, which happens to be the Confederacy. So if you're not big into American history, the Confederacy is essentially like a rebel faction that was defeated during the American Civil War. He is a slave owner, but for the most part, like, he doesn't have that many things that would make him a criminal target. Now, I'll get into this later, like I said, but he looks to try and bring glory and honor to his country, and his country happens to be a rebel faction. I'll get into this a little bit further in the video, but it's sort of hinted at, and you have to draw your own inferences. I recommend reading the short story itself, but it's hinted that he goes and tries to charge this bridge. This is where he's hanged. The entire short story is about him being hanged, and it's all about death, so that's why I'm starting with death as a theme. One of these quotes is about death being a dignitary, right? And these manifestations of respect, or I guess you could call them different things, but essentially like a salute to death itself. And this draws on one of the other central themes. It's more of a motif, right? A repeating literary element is the way I'm going to define that, so you don't need to know too much. The point that I'm trying to make here, right, is that death just shows up. It's saying that death's a dignitary, has manifestations of respect. These are people that treat death with respect. These are like military folks. So like the military folks are very different from the civilian. There's really only one real civilian within the immediate time frame, right? There's his wife and kids that are mentioned several times, and his wife is sort of not seen but mentioned in one scene of the short story. And it's important just to realize that the military characters, there's not that many of them, but they're in stark contrast to the civilian world. They have very sharp uniforms. They're executing a task very efficiently. They're like very orderly. These sorts of things denote and mark the civilian versus the military. This next quote, it's about his final moments. So the entire short story sort of ends with this. It's one of the ending couple sentences here. It's about this, he's being hanged here. And this is the hanging as it's taking place. This is when his neck snaps. It's all the shock of a cannon. This is another military reference. I'm sure he's heard many thousands of cannon shots all around his house because he lives in the Confederacy. He's in Alabama. That's where he lives. It all ends in darkness and silence, but the moment coming up to that is the shock of a cannon. And that also, it could potentially be a reference to the Civil War. It all ends sort of abruptly towards the end, but there's a lot of cannon shots, a lot of cannon sounds heard up until that point. Next theme, this is one that I'm a lot more interested in, so I'll probably spend some more time on it, is time. The first quote that I'm going to deal with is about his brain and the rapidity of lightning. So it's referred to that his thoughts are really fast. They're coursing like lightning, right? So it makes sense to me that this is a short story that's all about stream of consciousness. So in a sense, his mind is racing this entire time, but this is all within the span of like very short time. This isn't even a full day. There are moments that are before this time. These are memories that he's recalling, and in a sense, it's like a narration. When the times that are taking place outside of the short story are really, they just take place almost outside of time. They're within memory. The memory and time are inextricably tied together. It's an interesting way that he writes. Bierce has a way of weaving in someone's thoughts and someone's memory in such a way of writing it where it's like it's not exactly distinguishable from time, because that person's time, personal time, maybe I'll call it, is something that's tied with memory, and it happens in real time, but for him it occurs, all these different things at once in the span of like a second or a nanosecond. It's not clear how much time passes because so much time passes for him that for other people is just going by. But for him, he's living it to the fullest, and this is right before he's about to die. So this brings me to another quote that's really, really interesting. I love this quote. So this quote, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's super long, but the essence of the quote, right, is like he calls it a new disturbance. It's like this annoying thing. He's like, oh shit, what is this? He doesn't say that, but I imagine him saying like, oh, what is this? It's a ringing quality. It's immeasurably distant. It seemed like both. It's a recurring, annoying tone. And he's like, oh man. And then there's intervals of silence between these super loud tones. And it's like, what is this? He describes it as a blacksmith's hammer upon the anvil. So it's like someone's beating the crap out of an anvil with a hammer. And it's really, really interesting to me. I mean, among other things, these intervals of silence, right? Because when you get to the quote, you realize he's talking about the ticking of a watch, right? His own watch. And so these intervals of silence are in between the seconds. He's hearing this. It's super, super quick that it's happening, but this is a long paragraph because maybe this is only like 3 ticks of the watch, but he's extremely acute. Like his hearing is acute. His senses are like super, he's got super fine-tuned senses like a superhero or something. He's living his life to the fullest and it's just about over. It's something to behold. It's something to read. And again, if you're this far in the video and you haven't read the short story, or it's been 10 years or it's been 50 years or whatever, please go read it again. It's really great. Amborse Bierce, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. I don't want to get too farther into the quote, but this sort of just spells it out, right? With time, his relation to time is like extra spatial. It's like space and time don't exist for a time. And this might be because, the author chose to represent it this way. I mean, that's definitely why, but there's more to it. I think that there's a quality that he's trying to describe, like that memory and time. Like when you remember something or when you're thinking about something, you're creating a memory by existing. It's something that can't be measured by time. It's not like you can stick an instrument in your head. Maybe you can stick an instrument in your head and you can measure the brain impulse, but you can't measure whether the memory is being created. You can't capture that moment. He's capturing all that moment. All these moments, they're happening so quick for him. It's like he has super speed or something, and he's just watching all this happen, but he's also powerless. He can't move. He's bound up. And in a sense, that's almost like all of humanity. They're all bound up. We're all bound up. We can't really escape our fate. And that's going to be the next thing I'm going to talk about. But it's crazy to me. It's insane. It's like he captures the essential parts of human existence in talking about a ticking of a watch. And it's like a really long piece of it takes up an inordinate amount of space of the short story. It's really interesting. And then finally, this last one, this is a shorter one, and it just makes sense to me. But so it's all about this immediate quality. It's like this just immediately happens. It's a frightful roaring. The power of thought was restored. So what I'm interested in here is the suddenness, the thought being restored. So this is like the mind, the thought, the speed. This is all of it sort of tied together. For me, not as interesting as the ticking the watch, but I do think it's another example of speed, thoughts, times, memory, all sort of encapsulated in one quote. I could not go on without using that. Third, I want to talk about fate. And I think fate in this is really interesting in the way that Bierce represents fate. So fate, for me, fate is tied with home in this short story. So somehow it's so weird because, so this first quote is it's all about, he's conceptualizing how he can escape and how he can go away. This is a term of like escapism is what you could call it. But it's more than that. He's thinking about, and when Bierce is writing, it comes off as this sort of, maybe I could escape. Maybe things could have been different. Maybe this day could end differently. Maybe there's still time. And he's thinking about that. But what's interesting in here is he's not like distressed about it. He's not really upset about his fate. What he's really thinking about is how he can go home, how he can go see the people that he loves, which is, I think, what any reasonable person with family or friends that they'd want to see, or pet or something like that, where it's something that depends on you maybe. And especially with his home, his family, he's thinking of all the ways that he can, evade the bullets, swim vigorously, reach the bank, take the woods and get home, which is eventually what he does throughout throughout the short story. I'm not going to focus on that part of the short story, but it's just a longer version of this small quote, and it's a microcosm. It all happens so quick, just like him getting strung up and being hanged. It all happens so quick. His hanging is just, it all happens very quickly, and that's another, it's sort of related to the time, but it's really related to he can't escape his fate, but he's still in his mind, he's doing it. This is also, you could sort of interpret this as a way that he's rebelling. He's rebelling in a certain way against his fate. Even though he can't change it, he's conceptualizing it, he's visualizing it, and he's making it happen in a small way in his brain. And it can't change his circumstances, but maybe it makes him feel better as it's happening. It's just an essentially human thing. This other quote is related to death, it's related to fate, it's related to time somewhat, but when he's falling through the bridge and he's losing consciousness, this is weird for several things. It's like he hasn't died yet, but his fate is that he will die, and he knows that. And so he's seeing it before it happens. So he's coming to peace with it in a sense, and he's accepting his fate, even though there's nothing you can do, whether you accept it or not. If you're going to get strung up and hanged, that's your fate. You can't do anything about it, and it sucks. But anyway, that's part of what's really interesting about this is like his superpower is seeing things in a different way, and seeing things in a really interesting way sometimes. It's just it's quite interesting. Now the fourth one I want to talk about is about his hospitality and manners. So this is about his wife, who he calls the lady, and she brought water to this like soldier, but he's a Union soldier. Short story is called a Federal soldier, and he asks for water. They bring him water, and then he leaves, but he's a Federal scout, so the things that he says to the Federal scout are, they seal his fate. He asks him a question, which I'll get into later, but it's essentially like, oh, someone was so inclined, what could I do in regards to messing with that creek 30 miles up? And this guy takes notes of it. So it's either that he's a malcontent, or he's some sort of guy that they labeled as a pot stirrer and they rounded him up, or that he actually acted on his plans and tried to assault the bridge or take it down or whatever. As a military action led by one civilian, so it wasn't well prepared. And a lot of times, these civilians, they're trying to do and conduct a military mission, they're not going to have a lot of success. They don't have the background, they don't have the planning, and especially with one person, it doesn't matter if you do have the planning. You need more people oftentimes to take down an entire bridge unless it's unguarded, which it wasn't. Very interesting. So 5, there's unrepresented viewpoints in regular people. This whole story is about 2 I wanted to select here were civilian versus military, because this is another motif. I'm not going to quit. I'm going to keep mentioning it. The first one was about beyond one of the sentinels, nobody was in sight. This is one of those things where these people, these guards are out there, but they're really, you can't see them very well. It's like they don't matter. They're still there. They still have moral worth. Their life is still valuable, but they're not seen. This is one of those things where it's the authors are cluing you in. Hey, these people, they don't have a voice. You can't talk to them. You don't know if they were just or unjust, or if they had kids, if they all had families, what their motivation was exactly. They're just here to guard that bridge. This military etiquette, so this next quote is about the military etiquette, silence, fixity of forms. This is all, these people in uniform are anonymous. You don't know who they are. The only one that's mentioned by, not even name, but by title is the captain. He keeps being mentioned a couple times. These other people are like privates. They're the lowest of the low. They don't really have a position except to follow orders. They don't say anything. They shut up and guard the bridge. It's their job. All they do. The sixth part that I wanted to mention is, this isn't a point that he makes, but a point that I thought was interesting and worth mentioning. It's that the rebellion, which is the Civil War in this case, Confederate rebellion, pictures write history. So this is written after the Civil War. It's written in like 1890, I think. The American Revolutionary War, which sort of created America in a number of ways, could have likewise been crushed by the British, just like the Confederate Army was crushed by the Union Army. But it didn't happen. So if the Confederates had won or they had split over, I'm sure they would have written all manner of tales about the gallant South. That's sort of the stereotype. But evil things happen in war on both sides, and war stories like Owl Creek Bridge force some people to confront the reality that seemingly one-dimensional people are more than they might appear. And you sort of see that in this short story. You see that there's a multiplicity of people. There's all different people, all different views, but they are not all voiced, and they aren't all voiced well. You can infer what these soldiers are thinking, but they don't say anything really. The captain gives orders, the privates follow the orders, the farmer asks a question. The farmer thinks a lot, but this guy, Farquhar, he doesn't say a lot. None of these people say a lot. It's mostly observations. It's mostly about what you see, what you hear, what you think when you're about to die, and when that which is most precious you'll never be able to see again, and you're visualizing it in your mind. This is interesting, whether it would be Confederate or Union. This sort of, if it was the opposite, right, and you had a Union soldier being hanged, and the Confederate soldiers were watching him, it would still be very I would still read that. It would still be interesting. It doesn't matter exactly which side. Both sides did pretty terrible things. You look at any war, you look at any 2 sides, 3 sides, 4 sides, 5 sides, people are going to commit atrocities. People can be pretty awful to each other. It's about that there's more to some people. Looking beyond that, seeing what's the context. What's the morality behind this? What's the thoughts that went into this? Another thing that's interesting is, right, so Innocence. This is the 7th one that I thought was interesting. So, again, civilian versus military. I think this is an important one. Innocence, right? First quote is all about this man. He's 35 years old. He's a civilian. You might judge him that he was a planner. Well, he was a farmer. So, he's giving some baseline comments. This doesn't have to do exactly with Innocence, but that farmer, you wouldn't suspect that he goes out and murders people in the middle of the night. He might, but generally speaking, farmers are pretty tired and they go to sleep at night, that sort of thing. They rise early, they get a lot of planning done. And then this next quote is about how he's a well-to-do planner. He is from an Alabama family. He was a slave owner. He is a slave owner. He's a politician, and he wanted the secession, so he was all for the Southern cause. The circumstances of his imperious nature, which that has some undertones, I might address this here. I mean, the imperious, right, so imperial comes from the word imperium in Latin, and this essentially means that the man or the father of the household, the pater familias is what it was called, held complete and utter power over life and death, over the family. So you could, in Rome, right, I'd say probably like 750 BC to, I don't know, 400 AD or so. That's over 1,000 years. Imperium was a huge concept. You could kill your family members with impunity. You couldn't be tried in court. There were a couple exceptions, like if your daughters were married, they're your son-in-law's property, so you can't murder them. And also if your son was grown, there's some flies in the ointment. That it's not exactly that way, but generally speaking, you could act with impunity regarding your country, is the way that imperial comes from that. So when you're taking over an empire, you act as the pater familias for the entire state. This is an interesting idea because what he's saying here, I believe, is that the imperious nature carries on. These people, these politicians in the South wanted to take over. They wanted to treat their section of the country as if they had impunity all the time. What's interesting is that it didn't work out for them, right? Confederates are being hanged. There's hangings all over different bridges by Union soldiers. But you know what's interesting is to get that country back, these Union or federal troops, as Bierce calls them, they are acting with impunity and they are taking excessive force to quell a rebellion. So this Imperium concept is not dead. It's used by both sides. You could call this war atrocity, you could call it war crimes, you could call it unjust, but it's happening. It's all here. You know what's interesting too is that it ends with the phrase gallant army. So this is one of the other stereotypes of the South. If you're not familiar with the South, United States, it's often called gallant because of the manners. Right, manners are big in the South. But in the midst of this, these are a lot of times slave-owning people who did not treat their slaves nicely, who held people against their will, who oftentimes did really terrible things under the ruse of being gallant and having good manners, being respectful to all sorts of people, especially women. But that's not always the case. So it's like a veil here. This is a really strong paragraph. So this next quote, no service was too humble for him to aid the South, right? So he's a humble guy. He's willing to help his cause. No adventure too perilous. He was a courageous man. He was at heart a soldier, even though he's a civilian. So you could say this is like an interesting, it's a weird way to describe somebody, that they're a civilian, they're a sheep, but they are really a wolf. So it's a wolf in a sheep's clothing. So maybe it's okay that he was hanged. Maybe it's okay that he's about to get killed this entire time and that he's undergoing an execution during the entirety of the short story. That could be a justification. You could read it that way. This next part is all about the villainous dictum that all is fair in love and war. So is all this fine? Is all this cool? Is it permissible? For the soldiers, maybe. For him, maybe, because he went in knowing as a lone person that he's going to get caught and killed. And I care to believe that that's what happened. it could be a little different. It's left to inference. So this last one for the civilian side is, suppose a man, civilian, student hanging, we're pretty much going to go and take over that bridge. And this Farquhar guy, the farmer, is saying, what could he accomplish? So he's trying to gather intel himself here. He's a civilian that's trying to conduct a military operation. Go figure, it didn't go well. He's one person. He knew this. He didn't know that he was talking to a scout. He knew he was talking to a soldier, though, and you could probably infer that that's a Union soldier. There's a fair chance of it. He's in Alabama, which is really far behind Confederate lines, but it's difficult to say. Now, moving on to the military side. So this first one was about duty. This first quote on the military side is about duty. There's two ends of the foot. So there's two ends of the bridge. And these people, they're given orders to guard the bridge. They guard the bridge and they don't know anything else about, that's their goal. They don't care, if somebody's eating ice cream in another country. They're not thinking about that. It says their duty was to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge, was not to know anything else. They blockaded the two ends of the bridge, and that's it. They're very, very orders-oriented. If you look into the Holocaust, a lot of orders-oriented people did some pretty terrible things. This leads into my next quote, that the liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of persons. Gentlemen are not excluded. This is another thing, military permissiveness. When you're given orders and you have to execute them, it doesn't matter about the moral weight of it. You put it aside because you do what your commander tells you to do. I did terrible things. Well, my commander told me to do it, so it's okay. Well, maybe not okay, but it happened and I did it and I didn't have to think about it because I was given the right orders. My commander was working for a better cause, so maybe, I did something terrible, but I did it for the right cause. This is just something that people use to go to sleep at night, to allow them to have their conscience intact, but it's difficult. Last thing is more of a nuance that I think Bierce is presenting the reader. This is about formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. So somebody's standing upright and they are holding a rifle. And this to me means that the military action of holding the rifle, that standing at a certain armed position, is not natural. He says an unnatural position, you're not supposed to be like that. It's not human to be in the army and to be doing these things that oftentimes are evil. These orders that people were given, they differentiate you from being human. It's unnatural. You're no longer human. Human's natural. Now you're a different kind of animal. You're some sort of martial animal. You're some kind of military animal, executing orders without thought, because it's for the betterment of the state, or that's what you tell yourself. Interesting to think about. Now, the eighth one, right, is about family. This is an interesting theme. It's mentioned all throughout. This quote is about thinking about his wife and children, which ultimately is what this whole series of thoughts that he's had, that's what they culminate in. But this next quote is right about my home, thank God. My wife and little ones are beyond the invaders' farthest advance. I just think about that's not necessarily true. He loves his family and he wants to make sure that they're okay, but he can't, so he tells himself this. But in reality, if they rounded him up, they could just go and kill his whole family. Not that the Union would do that. They're supposed to be really morally upright. They're not protected by this guy anymore. This guy made his choices. He's about to die in a couple seconds. He can't undo things. He's now firmly in the arms of fate. Death is waiting to receive him, and he has no choice here. It's just, the wife and little one's image is very powerful. It's just one of those things. It's like, of course, he wants to see his family, he wants to make sure they're safe, but he doesn't have power over that. So he's outsourcing that to poor reasoning, I suppose. If they could get him, they could get his kids. If not them, the Confederates themselves, roving bandits, any number of things. And he's saying that they're beyond the invaders' farthest advance, Maybe, even if they were, they could die any second. So that's this whole thing. It's like, if he did everything in his power, maybe he wouldn't have been here. If he hadn't helped that soldier, maybe he wouldn't have been here. He wouldn't have got that intel about the bridge. He wouldn't have assaulted it. Or if he didn't assault it, maybe they wouldn't have come back and rounded him up. These things happen. And this whole thing he can't change, but he can change the way he looks at it. That's what he's doing here, talking about his wife and little ones. Ninth theme is all about nature. A lot of these, all three of these nature quotes are just about his observations about nature. How quickly the stream moves, how slowly it appeared to move, dancing driftwood. These are things that maybe if you're not going to die, you don't care about. But especially when you're sort of fixed to a position and you can't move and you can't escape, that death is imminent. Why not appreciate what you're around? Why not? This next one is about when he throws himself into the forest. He tries to escape in his wandering thoughts, and at some point he reaches the shore, and when he grabs up some sand, he sees them as diamonds, rubies, emeralds, all these precious jewels. He says he could think of nothing beautiful which it did not resemble. He talks about the plants, he talks about the trees, the fragrance of the blooms. He smells the flowers. He appreciates the good and everything and all these different things. And he's so excited to not be shot at, to not be executed, to be headed home, to be in close proximity to nature, to be one with nature. This is really interesting because in a sense, it's like this has come full circle, is that like he knows that he's been here in the past. He's been on the banks of near the forest. He's been to his home. He's remembering all these things. So he's also seeing these. So he's using his past memory in a sense, and he's using his observation, which is very keen, which we've covered. But he's using these in tandem, and it's in an interesting way. It's in a different way. He's appreciating things that he wouldn't have appreciated before because the finality of life is more apparent to him. It's like nature's always been there, but he's realizing maybe for the first and last time that, man, this is so sweet. It's all about to be ripped away from me. And then the last quote is self-explanatory. Bright and beautiful morning sunshine. It's something that's beautiful in the midst of something that's really not. This next 10th is more of a connection than a theme. It's something that's echoed in a somewhat popular song but that I really like, called The Green Green Grass of Home, and it's by Tom Jones, was written by. And these two quotes, they're just very similar. One person who's in prison, essentially, is what The Green Green Grass of Home is about. And it's a guy who has these dreams, he's dreaming, and he goes home, and he sees his family, and he sees things are the way that he left them, and that he's gonna maybe begin anew, and that things are very beautiful, and things are great. And then the curtain gets pulled away, or the rug gets pulled out from under the listener, and you realize that this person is in jail, and there's a guard there, and he can't leave, and he wants to go back and touch the green grass of home, but he'll never see it except in his dreams, or maybe if he gets executed like this guy that Bierce writes about. But it's just one of these things. It's like a timeless theme where you're trapped, but your mind finds a way out. It's an act of rebellion that you can control, and it's a really interesting thing. It's like in Blade Runner, this is another thing, I'm just talking about memories again, but like in Blade Runner, if you guys ever seen it, it's like memory is somehow tied in a really essential way to sentience or consciousness. And if you don't have memory, then you can't really have consciousness. You can't really, it's not something you can possess. It's something that's essentially you. It's essentially personal. It's the personal defining element for consciousness, personhood. Very interesting. I mean, this is an extreme example of that, where you can't escape physically, but you can escape mentally and into your thoughts and into your memories. It's something that is fascinating and very timeless. It's very human. It's very interesting. This is the end of the video, and I really appreciate you watching this far. I have one bonus. It's sort of something that I thought about that doesn't exactly apply, but it's somewhat related. There's one quote that I'm going to discuss quickly here, and it's about delusion. So this quote is all about this doomed man and his brain that is sort of being flooded by these thoughts, and it's like they haven't evolved, but they were flashed to him. They all just came to him, and it's like all these things just happened to him. This is another way of was he crazy? Because I thought of it when I was writing this video. When I'm speaking about this video, I don't know. I don't think he was delusional. I think he was a human being, and he made mistakes, and that's part of why he got there, but also the fate. He's in wartime. He's a man during wartime. You can't escape your fate sometimes. Your fate's to die during war. Who knows who's going to die and who's not? Nobody really knows, but the doom echoes fate, and the man's brain echoes the memories, the thoughts. The flash echoes the way he dies. It's in a flash of light that he experiences as his neck breaks, and it just all ends sort of abruptly, which I guess is in a sense how human experience ends. It can end abruptly. You don't know why it's going to end. There's not always a meaning to it. Part of what's human is to ascribe meaning to things that sometimes don't have meaning. Maybe this just happened, and in reality it's fiction. This represents the viewpoints of all those who died during wartime and didn't have a chance to write fiction about it. And that's essentially why this is such an interesting piece of art and such a great short story. If you like this, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe, or if you'd leave a like or comment or ask any questions that you feel like weren't answered. I love this short story, and I hope you do too. And I hope this video was informative and enjoyable for you. Appreciate you watching, and stay fantastic. Thank you.